And I'd like to start our webinar by taking a moment to acknowledge the place in which we are or would have been and soon will be gathered. The lands and waters currently occupied by the University of California, Davis hold the stories of Indigenous peoples from time immemorial. We acknowledge the ancestral and present relationship and responsibilities to this place for Patwin and Miwok peoples, which is now home to many peoples and nations. We ask that you also take a moment to consider the Indigenous places you reside on, wherever that may be, and offer a sense of gratitude for the Indigenous peoples who stewarded this land and water long before we arrived. Thank you. Welcome to the second of our 4 Radical Fermentation Dialogues. My name is Maria Marco, and I will serve as our introductory MC for this webinar. I'm a professor in the Department of Food Science and Technology at the University of California, Davis. My work centers on food microbiology and understanding how microorganisms may benefit our health. I specialize in the study of lactic acid bacteria for their roles in food fermentation and as probiotics. My research encompasses genetic, ecological, and microbiome-centric approaches designed to understand the molecular mechanistic basis for microbial interactions in the foods and in the digestive tract. Through my research, teaching, and service commitments, I strive to provide practical and inclusive approaches that allow us to relate to and understand microscopic life. This webinar series brings together coordinators of the Davis Humanities Institute Transcollege Research Cluster, Radical and Relational Approaches to Fermentation and Food Sovereignty, for interdisciplinary dialogue about fermentation science, Indigenous food security, food safety, performance, feminist science studies, and radical relational approaches to fermentation. The goal for each event is to offer explanations of our individual research projects as they intersect with cluster topics, and to explore the relationships between and amongst our seemingly disparate fields. We're pleased to welcome you to join us in our quest to build a research community. So for this webinar, we have the format where we will start with a brief introduction to the cluster, as I've just done, and we'll continue. And we will then turn to short individual introductions, after which Jessica will speak about her work, and then Stephanie will offer a response. And we will end with questions submitted from you for a brief Q&A. So please feel free to post questions at any time during the webinar. Questions we are not able to answer live, we will return to on our website. So now just a few brief words about our cluster. Indigenous communities regard traditional foodways as core components of community health and wellness. Yet traditional foods, such as those made by fermentation practices, are threatened by settler capitalist nation states that continue to legislate away Indigenous peoples' rights to ancestral lands and waters. The goals of this transcollege research cluster include curating a year-long series of convergence research activities that center radical and relational Indigenous knowledges and ways of fermenting foods. Ultimately, our cluster seeks to unsettle and expand dominant modes of knowledge production and food science research in ways that advances food sovereignty, an issue of urgent global significance for all peoples. Through curated gatherings and guest expert presentations, participants engage in collaborative projects that demonstrate how Indigenous food fermentation practices exist in relation with nature rather in control of, and how Indigenous scientific knowledges demonstrate deeply rooted or radical relationships between human, environment, and more than human entities. For more information, you're welcome to go to our website or email us at radicalfermentation@ucdavis.edu. So now I'm going to turn the mic over to Aviaya.
Thank you. Thank you, Maria. My name is Aviaya Lubert-Hauptmann. I'm a microbiologist by training. I have a PhD in microbial metagenomics from the Technical University of Denmark, and currently I'm a visiting postdoc at the Marco Lab. although I'm still based in Copenhagen for now. The focus of my research is indigenous fermented foods of the Arctic, and more specifically, Inuit fermented foods. I was born and raised in Greenland. I'm Inuit. And in the work that I do, it's very important for me that I bring in an indigenous perspective to the research that I do and how I treat the research. Very excited to be hearing Jessica's talk today. And over to you, Stephanie.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Stephanie Maroney, and I am a feminist science and food studies scholar who, I guess, specializes in creating collaborative projects on fermentation and, more recently, mycology. My research explores ferment and mycelium as methods for making, repairing, and caring for knowledges and relations. I've published articles on the sociocultural impact of human microbiome science, including topics like queer fermentation practice of sander cats, the colonial afterlife of microbiome science in ancestral microbiome research, and healthism as found in probiotic dietary culture, exemplified by all these cookbooks to eat for your microbes. I have a PhD in cultural studies from UC Davis, and I currently administer the Mellon Public Scholars Program at the Humanities Institute here, which is a community engaged arts and humanities program. Thanks for being here, and I am really happy to be the respondent to Dr. Jessica Bissett Perea, who will now do her introduction.
Great, thank you everyone. Let me go ahead and share what I've gotten into the practice in our strange remote times is to take a little bit more time with introductions. And so what I'm going to share with you is a quick 3-minute introduction to who I am and where I come from as an invitation to relate. And I'll talk more about that after this plays, but do let me know if you can't hear it. We can try it again. Ya rele du, Jessica Bissett Perea, Sheila Kilan. Dena'ina eshlan shida. Kena'ana eshlan shida. Kenak atnu shagu shagaya kilanda. Shel dina rele tet'ana eshlan shida. Nolchina eshlan shida. Unkoya Shaida Bedusa Alex Unkoyaga Sha'ana Nick Nikolai Shagu Relatin. Shita'a Virginia Nikolai Shagu Relatin. Philistel Shita'a John Platt Shata'a Relana. Shunkta Deborah Bissett in Lonink Udi. Mary Burkholder Shita'a Kenneth Bissett Shata'a Relana. Stukta Ronald Bissett in Lonink Udi. Shkizlan Reyayatnu. Deborah Shumta Ronald Stukta Atla Nite Shagu Kotan Re Ratna Reluda. Hallie Shaja Rachel Shtaja. John Carlos Perea Shken. Josephine Sa'a Jacob Shea. Ramaya Tusholoni Ethlena Yalamo Shukoya Yashtuda. Patwin Ethlena Puta Toy Ka'a Shuku Yashtuda. Chinan Hech Kishnashnu. Denainak Dududet Sheet. My academic pursuits have led me from Dena'ina Ethlena, my ancestral homelands, to Coast Salish lands currently occupied by Edmonds Community College, where I earned a general transfer degree and played on the golf team, to Yakima lands currently occupied by Central Washington University, where I earned a bachelor's degree in music education, to Numun, Niue, and Washishu lands currently occupied by the University of Nevada, Reno, where I earned a Master of Arts degree in music history, to Gabrielino and Tongva lands currently occupied by the University of California, Los Angeles, where I earned a PhD in musicology, to Putwin lands currently occupied by the University of California, Davis, where I'm currently an assistant professor of Native American Studies. In 2020, I founded the Indigeneity Collaboratory,
an Indigenous-led and Indigeneity-centered research collective, working to advance relational ways of being, knowing, and doing.
Great. And now I will change to the keynote. Great. So part of what I want to go through today, I'm going to do it in kind of three parts. The first is introductions, and so I start with this longer form introduction as a way of not only performing my own indigeneity, and as we'll maybe get to indigeneity as we understand it in critical Indigenous studies is not a sense of or the condition of being Indigenous, but something much more complicated and dense in terms of something that's always already tethered to colonization and racialization, given that we're speaking in the English language as the so-called lingua franca of academia, right? Certainly in the United States anyway. And in performing this kind of introduction for you, it's performing also an ethics of visitation, that this kind of introduction of telling you who my people's places and practices are is an invitation to relate and to put yourself in not only relation to me, but perhaps in relation to ideas or images or things that I bring up in my introduction, a way of starting a conversation, right? And part of this from a Native American studies or a critical Indigenous studies perspective is a very purposeful and political move in terms of announcing literally our positionality and our relationality to the research and to the work. And that does a lot in terms of erasing the objectivity or the so-called objectivity of research as usual, right? That there's a certain amount of white supremacy, which is a concept that has taken up a different import in our recent cultural climate, at least in the US in the last 4 years. And so part of announcing one's positionality or relationality is not only an invitation to interact with one another in a different way, but also to remove the veil of so-called objectivity and in explaining who is asking, who is doing the asking, who am I, where do I come from, and what are my commitments and responsibilities. And in part of that, there's also just this, from moving from kind of introductions and then going into the second part of what I wanted to address today in kind of short form are some foundations of where my research has been and where my research is going, but also in relation to the topic of the transcollege cluster that brought us here today in terms of, many people might ask, what is a musicologist doing in a research cluster on fermented foods and food sovereignty? Well, I'll explain a little bit of that today too in terms of the second part. And the third part of the talk, I want to draw attention to some really important and critical work being done in my home state of Alaska with the Inuit Circumpolar Conference and funded by the NSF in terms of food security and food sovereignty and self-governance, Inuit-led self-governance. And so part of what I want to do to broaden out a little bit, to spell out, using these imperfect English words, some of my preoccupations in Native American studies are these words, right? So if we even start with Native American studies. So one of the things that I think is exciting or useful for the uniqueness of this cluster at UC Davis is that the Native American Studies Department is one of the oldest in the United States and is one of only 3 PhD programs. So in terms of training the next generation of scholars, we take that very seriously, and that's perhaps one of my absolute favorite things about being here is the opportunity to work with brilliant upcoming scholars who I'll again shout out at the end in terms of the collaboratory that we've formed. And so with Native American studies, what tends to be understood as the ethnic studies over in Hart Hall are really also drawing attention to, as our founders did 50 years ago, that much of what happens in the university is a form of European ethnic studies. And what Native American studies and many of the other programs in Hart Hall are simply asking for is equity and a densification of knowledge production in academia. And so whereas a lot of my work as a musicologist, or certainly someone who is trained in music, was concerned with representation, or rather a lack thereof, in terms of being one who's more attuned to oralities and auralities, a sound in silence, or a presence and absence. Native American studies is a sovereign field that is here to amplify and forward Native American studies and Native American peoples' sovereignty, self-determination, and autonomy. In my own teaching, I've recently come to a place where, for me, these three terms can also be thought of more broadly as peoples, places, and practices. And in that way, when we do things like an introduction to Native American Studies courses for undergraduate or graduate level, we really are always trying to invite people to relate. Part of what sometimes gets misunderstood in an introduction like the one I performed for you is that Native American studies or research involving Indigenous peoples, there's this misconception that only Indigenous people should be doing it. If only that, that's a major misconception, because it's going to take people from all walks of life to do the work that needs to be done to undo centuries of colonialism and racialization globally. And we're not even just talking about the Americas, right? So in terms of peoples, we really do value and welcome all peoples to do this work, because again, one of the interesting things that comes out of Indigenous ways of doing what we call science is that it's also not human-centered, right? But humans have for so long sought to control and to master things such as ecology and environmental sciences and lots of other things that from an Indigenous worldview perspective, it's much more about a holistic approach, which we'll get to in a second. With places, we want to emphasize not only, as Maria articulated in the land acknowledgement, and to also state for the record that part of what this collective is trying to do, our Radical Fermentation Research Cluster is trying to do is take the land acknowledgement to the next level, which is a major critique of these acknowledgements of place that then aren't followed with any kind of actual actionable items or involvement of Indigenous peoples and respect of Indigenous peoples' knowledge systems. And so with places, there's also this inferring of spaces, that Native American studies is also a space, an intellectual space, a critical space that calls into question, in the language you saw in my introduction in terms of Putatoi currently occupied by University of California, Davis. That's a discursive flourish, if you will, to call attention to the fact that these places that we know in the English language and through institutionalized and policy-driven land grab university sites such as UC Davis, that they're temporary, or they haven't been here for all time, right? What has been here for all time in these places and spaces are Indigenous knowledges and Indigenous relationships to human, more than human, and environmental entities. With practices, we really want to call attention again to the studies aspect, right? The studies being of the research that we do at a Research One university, such as University of California, Davis, right? And that it's a doing, right? And so with this comes in this kind of triumvirate of being, knowing, and doing. That that of course, while also on the page, not only is English language kind of misleading, the segmenting out of these ideas as three discrete columns is also incredibly misleading, because these things are intricately intertwined in terms of being as bound up in knowing, and knowing is bound up in doing. Right. And so a lot of what we're trying to densify in academia is privileging Indigenous-led and Indigeneity-centered questions, research design, researchers, unsettling the idea of who counts as a researcher and who has the right to know, and also politics of refusal in a lot of ways, because before Native American studies became what it is in terms of a discipline and a field, Native American peoples were studied on or about, people studied on and about Native American peoples in anthropology and history and many other disciplines. And so it's just important to know that being, knowing, and doing also comes with an immense amount of responsibility and commitment to protecting Indigenous knowledge systems at all costs. And with this, in the kind of research that we do with our graduate students, for sure, we really think about ideas or keywords. You know, any of these words on this page or this slide could be thought of as keywords, along with security and sovereignty and self-determination and indigeneity, all of these keywords as ideas that, you know, we want to resist any sense of easy definitions. And part of the densifying of ideas is really understanding what we're doing as explaining from a positionality, from a subjectivity that is grounded in our lived experiences, in our academic training, in our personal and professional commitments, that who's asking really matters in terms, and who's also explaining matters. And with that comes a sense of logics or analytics that somebody brings to a project. And so what Native American studies and critical Indigenous studies seek to do is centering indigologics, centering Indigenous logics, and that all of this being processual, that part of what is important about, some of you may be familiar with settler colonial studies, and Patrick Wolf's assertion that colonialism isn't an event but a structure, or an event, not an event but a structure. But part of what we don't want to get fixated on is continuing to necessarily only study structures of settler colonialism. Part of what Native American studies is bound and determined to do is to uplift and amplify structures of indigeneity, which are not purely Indigenous spaces because of the fact of histories of centuries of colonization, certainly in the Americas. And with that, where I get to in my own work, and it very much inspired by the Anishinaabe archaeologist Sonia Adelaide, is her community-based archaeological work, her research. And she was one of the first researchers I came across who really articulated clearly the shift, the epistemological, ontological, all the logics of shifting from on and about to with by for. And I think that's something that this research cluster shares in terms of our commitment to the work we're trying to do that is Indigenous-led, indigeneity-centered, with, by, and for the communities with whom we're engaged with and responsible for. And so one of the things I think we'll get to by the end of this talk is this idea, again, of density. You keep hearing me talk about density instead of difference, because I think in this cultural climate where diversity, equity, inclusion offices and programs are doing an immense amount of fantastic work, we want to move beyond also this idea, moving beyond land acknowledgements and moving beyond kind of tokenism of representation, that to densify scientific knowledge production at University of California, Davis will actually require inviting in of community experts and community scholars. It will involve, a rebalancing, a radical rebalancing of curricular outcomes and objectives, right, for all of our disciplines. And not to say that like Indigenous studies needs to replace everything, but indigeneity and indigeneity studies of Indigenous structures are one of many communities whom are in dire need of being better represented and accounted for in these spaces, chiefly because we'll be talking about how Indigenous studies knowledge is and how our Indigenous knowledge systems hold critical knowledge for information in terms of food security and resource management, but also climate change, environmental justice, and many other critical issues that face all of our community, all humankind, all of our more than human and environmental kind. So these are just some kind of opening keywords and a very more organized crazy wall for those of you that have seen my other kinds of teaching. But what I want to move to now is kind of this foundations of where I'm coming from. And one thing that I think is useful in teaching and in talking with folks who are unfamiliar with the Arctic is to do a simple Google test, a Google litmus test of putting in the Arctic, as you see that I've done here in this search this morning. This is from this morning. And if you just kind of scan the images of perhaps whatever the algorithm wants me to see, maybe it would be different for you. I'm not a computer scientist, but in terms of the algorithm, this is what Google wanted me to see this morning. But what I'd like to point out, when we think about the Arctic, so often it's characterized as a frozen wasteland. And, you can count on one hand kind of images that would implicate that there are humans there. Usually humans are a present absence when we think about or Google imagery for Arctic, right? It's usually the polar bears who are endangered and drowning on ice floes that are melting because of climate change. And of course, that's a serious problem. But there's also the serious problem of ignoring the immense density of indigeneity that is in the Arctic. Because one of the things that I think that our research will call attention to, and something that as someone who grew up in Alaska and lived the reality of being in a place where 20% of the population is native, that's unthinkable in a place, especially like California. And that has a lot to do with the particularities of colonization and the different histories. Many people want to think that colonization was long ago and far away. Well, not for California Indians and not for subarctic folks. Alaska only became part of the Union in the mid 20th century because that was the first time when there was a white majority population that could vote statehood into being. And so there's just a lot has to be forgotten to think about the Arctic as unpeopled. But on the other hand, it is important to understand that, like many indigenous worldviews, humans are one of many entities that we need to be taking into consideration in terms of a holistic approach to what we're thinking about in science. And some of the things that I'm interested in with this research cluster in particular is thinking about the word subsistence. Because where I came from, these are images of my hometown, with the exception of the bottom right, which is Fairbanks Experimental Farm. I grew up in the Matanuska-Susitna Valley, which for many people is known as the breadbasket. It was an experimental place with these experimental farms here on the right side of the screen, where scientists and researchers sought from the 1930s to present day, they're still experimenting, ways of growing vegetables and other kinds of foods, non-indigenous foods, in the Matanuska-Susitna Valley, in Fairbanks. And as a Dena'ina person growing up on my homelands, all I knew were things like Colony High School, and the lower left hand being an image of Colony Days Parade, right? That our own histories and our own homelands were completely erased and replaced by literally the word colony. So I just want to kind of point that out, that agriculture for me has been a complicated subject. Because it's literally been mapped onto our homelands. And the anthropological explanation of subarctic peoples as less civilized because of our hunter-gatherer status is one I'm very keen to complicate in the kinds of work that we're going to be doing together in this cluster. And so what I wanted to show here was to take subsistence a little bit further. And so this is a screenshot from the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, defining what subsistence fishing and hunting is from a nation state definition. Again, this is where I hope our work will complicate and densify even these kinds of definitions. And so what is it? It is food. It's non-commercial, customary, and traditional uses of fish and wildlife. So food, sharing, has to do with clothing, tools and goods, transportation, handicrafts, homes and other building. And so this idea of it being something separate from commercialization is going to be interesting, because I know Maria also shares concerns with things like when things are industrialized and commercialized and what gets lost in these massive, larger scale operations when we talk about food safety and food security, nutrition, community health and wellness. And so the human cost of commercializing and industrializing. Some of the foundations for me in terms of my own research, Angayakak Oscar Coagley, one of Alaska Native scholars, late scholar, he passed in 2011, science educator and very much lived a very dense and complicated life as a previous president of one of our Alaska Native corporations, put out this beautiful book, a yupiak worldview, a pathway to ecology and spirit. And part of what is is always difficult when talking with folks who are either new to Native studies or you know, especially students, right? Is this idea that these words, ecology and spirit, religion and science, are really imperfect, and again as keywords, because from Indigenous worldviews, and when we think about our languages more specifically, yupiak is the way of the human being, and what this image is, what Coagley was trying to illustrate using this visual model, a tetrahedral model that he modeled off of a fish rack, a fish drying rack, right, is that a worldview is, of course, intimately intertwined with one's spiritual realm, human realm, natural realm, and that it's rooted in self, family, communal, and mindfulness. That, you know, so much of what we think, the rub or the tension between trying to define something versus explaining it from a particular worldview is what is talked about in performance studies, or certainly improvisation studies in my world, as the difference between an is and an as or could be. So in terms of subsistence is these things according to the Department of Fish and Game, versus, you know, subsistence as, or what could subsistence be if we understood it from a more dense perspective. And that is certainly something that Indigenous ways and Indigenous knowledge systems bring into being. And so this model, before I even knew I would be doing science research a decade later, this model for me was just, it was the head exploding emoji moment for me as a musicologist. I'm like, oh, so music is one of many ways of doing indigeneity, right? That we sound it, and in that sound carries an immense amount of relationships to these human, more than human, and environmental realms. And so in terms of things that I would hope that we have time to read, certainly in our reading group next term, is that, as well as a lot of Anne Finer-Riordan, who's an anthropologist by training, you know, European descent, but adopted into Yupik communities, and for as long as I've been alive, about 40 years, she's been putting out a book a year. She is an incredibly prolific writer, and working with, by, and for, in the trenches with Yupik elders, in terms of getting everything from repatriation of material items from museums to this masterworks of Yupik science and survival. You know, she's curated countless museum exhibitions, and I want to share this one and point this one out in particular, which you can check out at yupikscience.org. It's a little bit of an older website, but the information's still there and wonderful. And what I love about this particular screenshot, and what I wanted to share with it, is just the use of scientist as a word that doesn't have a translatable corollary in the Yupik language, right? And that the statement by Paul John, the late Paul John, father of one of the preeminent Yupik musicologists who I love and admire, Teresa John, he said here in the translation, our Yupik ancestors apparently were complete with everything needed to keep their culture alive. They had experts who could measure and understand happenings in their daily lives. Our ancestors were apparently scientists. And so it's this funny thing that when we start paying more close attention to language, and in many Indigenous languages, they're very verb doing oriented, right? Things are verb centered. Whereas in English language, we tend to be kind of noun, people's, places, things, even, you know, centered. And so the difference between the active and the agential language nature of Indigenous languages is an interesting one to put here. That there's no word for music in our languages. There's no word for scientists in our languages. A lot of the disciplines that we have in the academy, there are not a lot of Indigenous. We will make them up and we will improvise them in the present day. But just to point that out, I love this particular quote for that reason. This is a screenshot of what you'll see on the homepage for the menu of Yupik Science. And it's just to point out that subsistence, of course, is not just the act of gathering, hunting, or fishing. It's not the kill act, as I think Katz has said, Senator Katz has said in one of his books about the kill act as being murderous. Well, not from an Indigenous standpoint, in terms of we understand that it takes prayer and good thoughts and doing things in a good way for the animal to give themselves. And so a lot of what these different this cycle, and it's perfect, of course, and probably deliberately planned as a circle to show the cyclical nature of always getting ready, is how it's usually phrased, that we're always getting ready to prepare ourselves, prepare our minds, prepare our relationships, and nurture them and steward them with our more than human and environmental relatives and entities, and that it's a year-long cycle. So what we'll be doing in terms of really zeroing in on the microbiology of Inuit fermented foods, we'll also be taking into account this much kind of macro view of everything it takes to even get to the lab to do the microbiology. And that's exciting to me, because I think that Marie and I may sit at opposite ends of a spectrum, but it's one that's complementary, I think, in the end. And that's what our group will work to strive to do, is to think about arts and sciences and how we meet at various points and registers along the way. There's this Inuit Circumpolar Council of Alaska has recently released, over the last 4 or 5 years, has been releasing great reports on food sovereignty and self-governance in the yupiak communities, and Yupik. They're doing kind of north coastal Alaska, and they've come up with Inuit-led definitions or explanations of food security and Inuit food sovereignty. And at its core, again, is this what we share in critical Indigenous studies, that it is Indigenous-led and Indigeneity-centered. And in a way that advances sovereignty, autonomy, self-governance, however you want to use those words, because again, sovereignty is also one of those imperfect English words. So I just want to point this out and encourage you to check it out in terms of and I'll have it on my bibliography slide as well, of this immense undertaking by the ICC, funded by the NSF. A couple of images and figures from the reports are worth sharing here, in terms of this beautiful ecosystem portrait that was inspired by how elders talk about the interconnectedness of the ecosystem as like a puzzle, pieces of puzzles, and that you can't have one without the other. And, it's a multi-species approach as opposed to a single species, human-centered approach, that it's going to a multiple entity approach, right? A multimodal approach. It's not just kind of what we know as terms of literate. It's embodied knowledges. It's our oralities. It's all of these things that Indigenous knowledges understand the holistic nature and of that is required to fully understand community health and wellness. And that, again, is from the 2015 report they did. And then usually the ICC in particular, their logo is one that centers the drum. And this is just another graphic that comes from their reports, which I think is just beautiful and illustrates, by putting food security at the center, it's about environmental health. It requires accessibility, availability, stability, health and wellness, decision-making, power and management, Inuit culture. And then out of that, there's a need for more balanced, or certainly more yupiak and Inuit and Yupik-led knowledge sources, policy, and co-management. And at the very outer rim, you'll see the different words from the different communities for spirit, for environment, for weather, for everything and all being, right? That the universe. Again, English fails us here to really encapsulate everything that encompasses a worldview, but that's where yupiak would also likely appear. One last image I want to share here is what they are saying as the interconnecting drivers surrounding walrus within a given time and space. And I think it's really going to be fascinating to, in our remote, sometimes synchronous, sometimes asynchronous reality right now in our pandemic situation. It really, for me anyway, has disrupted my understanding of just space-time and time-space. And what I think we've probably always already known, that the way, not only the cyclical nature of always getting ready for subsistence practices, that there are any number of factors that always have to be considered at the same time, right? That our ancestors and our elders are incredibly and have always had intellectual prowess and just the immensity of what they carry in terms of Indigenous knowledge systems is sadly not yet well respected in many academic settings. And so that's another thing we seek to upend in the work that we're going to be doing by really uplifting and amplifying community scholars and elders as researchers, elders as experts, that it's not just those of us with this piece of paper that says PhD on it, that the lived experiences on the land and in place are as important, if not more important, certainly more important to coming to Indigenous-led and Inuit-centered, in this case, solutions to food security. This is a diagram that Avia shared with us when we first got together, and what I love about it, by a Northwest Coast chef and activist, that we usually think about, thinking about the primacy of the food pyramid, right? And we're probably all very familiar with what we learned in public school, in terms of like a little bit of oils, a little bit of sugars, lots of meats, lots of breads and vegetables. Well, the diet, and Avia will speak much more eloquently to this in the North, we don't have Whole Foods on every corner. And for a long time, especially in the research that I do with foreign Inuit and Indigenous artists, we've been saying for a long time that the ways that European ideologies are mapped onto Arctic spaces, in my case through things like experimental farms and reindeer and muskox domestication, animal domestication, these are things that are taught and studied very closely here at UC Davis. Maybe not specifically the Alaska context, although I would love to know if there are folks here that do that. But this idea that even a close consideration of the kinds of diets that we've ate since time immemorial up until colonization were not the Western European diet, and that it's not, again, this is another visual that shows the always getting ready and the deep cultural significance of something as simple as what we think of as simple as eating, or maybe we could, because as you see in preserving, fermenting is one of many ways that folks will do this. So at the bottom of everything is teachings, worldviews, knowledges, right? And from that, you have to get ready with tool making. You have to get ready to harvest. You have to get ready to share and to save, and to cook and to share. And so at the core of all of this is a sense of community centeredness and groundedness. These again are some artists that I encourage everyone to check out if you haven't already. Zacharias Kunuk, a very famous Inuit filmmaker who has done his trilogy, the Fast Runner trilogy, the Adanarjuet, is perhaps his best known film. But he's recently gone into this series called Hunting with My Ancestors, where they take you literally on hunts with his community members, and everything from walrus to bear to any number of different kinds of foods that are available where he is in the Canadian Arctic. Tanya Tagat-Gillis is a musician who we've hosted here at UC Davis in 2015, who has collaborated with Kunuk on a short piece, Tungujuk, What We Eat, as a talking back to the Jane Fondas and Bridget Bardots of the world who are anti-sealing. And now I guess Ellen DeGeneres would be counted in that list too. In terms of these policies, in the statement about what this cluster seeks to do is draw attention to the colonial nation-state underpinnings of legislations that take away Inuit and Indigenous subarctic peoples' rights to the lands and waters and subsistence lifeways that are critical to our health and well-being. Altia Arnakuk Baril's Angry Inuk is another recent film that shows the heartbreaking realities of kind of the futility, really, of looking at something like the United Nations, which is still very nation-based. We have the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is a great step in terms of starting to talk about the complications and the particularities of Indigenous peoples globally. However, the United Nations is tied to nations, to nation states. And so what this film shows is, what ended up being a bit of a futility of Inuk activists going to the UN to advocate for sealing rights, right, for community survival. And I would highly recommend the film. And then fourthly, down here is another yupiak dancer choreographer, Emily Johnson, who Kinstolori is one of her methods in terms of really thinking about relationality and embodied knowledges and movement in relating to people through dance and choreography and movement, embodied knowledge. So she's also somebody that we hope to bring to campus in the not too distant future. But with that, I just wanted to end with kind of thanking everybody, thanking my colleagues in this research cluster. It's been an honor so far to come down this journey with you, and I look forward to where we get to together. Thank you to my students pictured here for the Indigeneity Collaboratory. It's my continuation to grow and to be challenged and intellectually and emotionally and otherwise, especially in these pandemic times, is in no small part to the amazing work that they are all doing. I want to thank department and campus colleagues, especially folks who have funded this work over the years, and particularly inspired by Kalindi Vora's work in the Feminist Research Institute, inspired the collaboratory name. The Davis Humanities Institute has funded various projects of mine over the years. UC Davis Global Affairs has recently come into the picture for us. We're going to be working with them to do grants for this Greenland-centered project that we're embarking on. And the Manavi Center for what we're looking forward to with the fall course that Marie and I will co-teach, and Avia and Stephanie will be core members of as well, in terms of advancing our radical and relational approaches to Inuit food security and food fermentation and food sovereignty. So I have a works cited slide that we can come back to if there are any questions, but that kind of there endeth. Where did I go? There I go. There ended the things that I was hoping to get through, and since it was kind of a yellow patty talk, I'm very happy to take questions, or certainly to start with Stephanie and your response.
Thank you so much, Jessica. That was so beautiful. I have questions and comments prepared, but I wanted to just recognize like the effective response of watching you tell us about your history and the history of the place you are, and how your work on densifying is something that I think is so intimately tied to your positionality. And you really have demonstrated, I think, for all of us, how you can connect your positionality, your relationality to the kinds of work, that you do in the world. And it was just very beautiful. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
I had a couple, things to think with you about, and I also saw some questions come through the Q&A. So I think there's time for maybe 2 explorations of some ideas. The first is about densifying, which I love as a concept, and I also love that it exists against something like diversity, and the way we've seen that employed in the academy and in other spaces, as a kind of shallow politics of representation, of counting, right? Mm-hmm. And that density is something so much deeper than that. And so tied into how one makes something dense, how to densify, requires a kind of acknowledgement of contradiction. And it's not about a kind of pasting over of difference or acknowledging it and then kind of moving beyond it, but something, I like your definition, but it reminds me from my own world in feminist science studies of the way that Donna Haraway articulates staying with the trouble, staying with it, not attempting to move through it or to explain it away. And I wondered if you could just say a little bit more about practices of densifying and densification. You were kind enough to let me read a introductory article that you co-authored with a special issue of a journal. And in particular, you were writing about, in asking the indigeneity question of American music studies, you use the work of Opaskwayak Cree Nation scholar Gregory Younging's Elements of Indigenous Style. So you think about densifying considerations of indigeneity in American music historiography through style principles, which was really lovely. And I wondered if you had any preliminary thoughts towards how densifying might happen, or what it might look like as a practice within fermentation science, or where are the places we could start with that?
Oh man. So I think that, for one of the many challenges that we face in the research, teaching, and service that we do in Native American studies is that term itself, Native American, right? That it covers it kind of erases the density of our indigenous being, and this is all the density argument is Chris Anderson, Métis scholar at University of Alberta. I believe he's still the dean of Native faculty there, and thank you, Colton Brando, for introducing me to this a couple of years ago. But the idea that for what a caricatured version of ethnic studies is a difference producing machine, that you come to ethnic studies or you come to Native studies to learn about the other, right? And what I love to do when students come into classes or in my research or writing is to really kind of flip the script or flip the lens and really ask students and folks who come to the table to tell us more about you. And I think that that's one thing that feminist science has really done beautifully in terms of I think about Harding and Haraway's work, and particularly the idea of strong objectivity, that's really what we're asking for here in terms of a density as a both and, that I think it was Clifford's definition of juxtaposition, James Clifford's, where it's a simultaneously bringing together while keeping apart, and thinking about, so much of kind of what is, and it's funny actually, as I'm saying this out loud, it's funny to think how UC Santa Cruz and History of Consciousness and that program is kind of underlying a lot of the conversations we're having in terms of Indigenous feminist science and technology studies, but also thinking about the folks at Alberta, like Chris Anderson and Density. And so, when I think about something like the ICC NSF Food Sovereignty and Food Security Report, some people would look at that like, well, they've done it. We have an Inuit study in food security, so we can stop there. When we think about the immense density across and between not only Inuit communities across the Circumpolar Arctic, but what kinds of things could we learn from fermentation science in the Arctic that we don't know already, and that Avia and Maria and you as microbiology oriented folks know, that could be useful and significant for rethinking what we know about food and fermentation elsewhere, but also that unsettling of kind of an agricultural centered model to understanding of civilizations, and that kind of Enlightenment era scientific racism that's always kind of lurking in the shadows. So I think that part of densification is just, even within a community, this is something I always tell my students, there's this anthropological model of always looking for the one beacon of knowledge, the one elder who can tell you everything. Well, that one elder might disagree with somebody else's auntie or elder. And so it's just, even within a community, there's a dense array of knowledges and understanding, and that the incommensurability that you mentioned is definitely something that is talked about forcefully in Eve Tuck and Kei Wen Yang's Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. That part of what any of what we're trying to do in Indigenous studies, but also in this cluster, I think, is to also just let the differences stand. Some things can't be solved, and that attempt to solve problems all the time, that we need one solution, does an immense amount of violence and erasure, right? I mean, that's when we think about boarding schools, one education for all, did an immense amount of trauma and violence to our communities. And so I think that the job that we have ahead, the really critical work that we have ahead, is continuing to problematize, there's one Native American religion, there's one Native American way of doing science, that we have incredibly, and it's all based, in the Arctic, for example. Hopefully we'll be talking more about the meat-based diet, right? And just that not much grows in the Arctic, and we were okay with that for millennia, right? There were other ways that we would get the other kinds of nutrients that we tend to fret about here in the lower 48. So I don't know if that completely answered your question, but definitely some things that came to mind.
No, that was lovely. Yes. There was another question, and I think you did answer it, about if there are limits to densification, if incommensurability becomes incoherence at some point, But I thought when you helped us understand the difference between is and as could be, right? That I think that the incommensurability is actually a more, it's a truer representation of the world that we live in, and that while, it's interesting to think about the limits of densification, I think that we should, it's, for me right now, feels more important to think about the violence that has been done by, the counterpart of forcing the singular definitions. And I think instead of stopping the work by being overly concerned about its limits, I think part of the process is to explore where those limits might be and see them become, rather than assuming that it's enough to stop us in our tracks.
Yeah.
I wondered if you had any more to say just on that topic, or about
just that it's something certainly folk in Indian Native people in North America feel acutely because of colonial measurements and containment of our blood, of our DNA, of our being. I mean, it's something that we're the only peoples with a government agency to be a bureaucracy for us, and so it's just something like I don't have any interest in those limits in terms of. I don't think that there are limits to densification, that what really matters, I think, at the end of the day, and what an Indigenous worldview that is very locally grounded can do is, it shows not only what we don't know, but it asks for an unknowing of things as the one true way, right? And that what I think, instead of maybe thinking of limits, if you needed or wanted to limit to where you are, do the homework of whose lands you're on and whose people you're with and your surrounding communities, especially in our university settings, right? That we could be doing a lot more work. I could be doing a lot better work. We all could be doing more deliberate work to connect with where we are and who's there and who's always been there and what are their practices, what are their knowledge systems. And so if you wanted to limit yourself, start at home. The revolution starts at home is one of those great feminist sayings, right? And so I think that could be said of university researchers too. And that's not to say that, I mean, the work that we're embarking on with Aviaya in Greenland and with community partners out there needs to be done. And it's one of many starting points for us to then start to think about, okay, so we have the connections in the community work and examples in Alaska, for example, of this work that's being done. How can we then mobilize that as a model to try and do better at home, right?
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, limit yourself in your own backyard. That's great. We have just 2 minutes left, and I wanted to just recognize that there were two other great questions in the chat that we will probably get to at a later date. One, which it was about exploring radical and relational as concepts, and I would just say to that questioner that I think that's part of what we're doing together as a group on this topic. So hang in with us, and we'll continue to kind of figure that out together. Although drawing from your work, Jessica, our website does have a further kind of explanation of what we think around relational and radical. And then there was another question about, I guess it's kind of like the politics of doing funded work that is not Indigenous led, but is kind of and on Indigenous people. And so I think that's something maybe we could compile some resources toward that question, because it's a big one.
Yeah.
And then there was another question, I think, that was maybe more about my work, but I can answer that in my presentation, which is coming up next. So I wanted to say thank you to Dr. Bissett Perea and her very moving and beautiful work that reminds us all to take a look at where we are and think about the way that shapes how we move in the world and make knowledge of that world. And thanks to all of our participants who hung in there for our talk this hour. And stay tuned. In 2 weeks, we will have the next installment, which will feature me talking more about my work with Maria Marco in conversation. And then the work will conclude with Maria's presentation in another 2 weeks. So thanks again, everyone. Stay tuned to radicalfermentation.ucdavis.edu for more information about our work. Bye for now.